who started it.
No, she did.
Now,
Dennis. It was all her fault.
wait a minute, that's enough.
Picture a Saturday morning in 1974. You wake up, pour yourself a bowl of cereal, plant yourself in front of the television, and suddenly you're watching a father and his two kids get swallowed up by a waterfall and dropped into a world of dinosaurs, lizard men, and ancient mysteries that nobody fully understood, not even the people making it. It was weird, it was ambitious, and for a whole generation of kids, it was the best part of the week. This is the story of the rise and fall of Land of the Lost, why it ended at its peak. Part 8, How It All Started, the Croft Brothers, and a book full of pictures. To understand Land of the Lost, you have to start with Sid and Marty Krofft. By the early 1970s, the Croft Brothers were already a dominant force in Saturday morning television. They had built their reputation on wildly imaginative, puppetry-driven shows. H.R. Pufnstuf in 1969, Lidsville in 1971, Sigmund and the Sea Monsters in 1973. These were colorful, psychedelic, and deliberately strange programs that felt like nothing else on TV at the time. Kids loved them, networks trusted them. And when it came time to pitch something new, Sid and Marty had the rare luxury of being heard. But Land of the Lost was something different, a real departure from everything they had done before. There would be no oversized puppets, no neon-colored talking furniture, no comedy-driven silliness. This time, they wanted a live-action adventure series, something grounded, something with genuine dramatic stakes. They had a general idea in mind: dinosaurs, a family, a strange world, but the specifics were fuzzy. What they needed was someone who could take a rough concept and build an actual universe out of it. That person was David Gerrold. Gerrold was a science fiction writer who had already made a name for himself through his work on Star Trek, where he had written the beloved episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, in 1967. In 1973, the Croft brothers approached him about developing their new show.
But inhospitable. Who are...
What happened at that initial meeting became something of a legend in television circles. Gerrold was handed what he later described as a scrapbook, a loose collection of photographs and images cut from magazines, bound together under the title Land of the Lost. There was a waterfall, a jungle, dinosaurs, ape-like creatures, and a few other scattered images. That was it. That was the brief. Most writers would have been confused. Gerrold was inspired. He took that pile of images and built something remarkable. He conceived the Land of the Lost not as a prehistoric corner of Earth, not as a simple dinosaur park, but as a pocket universe, a closed, self-contained dimension accessible through time portals. The entire world was a loop. If you climbed the highest mountain and looked through binoculars at what lay beyond the valley, you would see the back of your own head. There was no getting out, not easily, and the mystery of that trapped world became the engine that drove the series. Gerrold named the primate-like people the Pakuni, and the terrifying reptilian humanoids that stalked the ancient city he called the Sleestack. He introduced the concept of pylons, metallic, featureless structures scattered throughout the jungle that, when opened with the right crystal configuration, could control aspects of the world itself: weather, time, the movement between dimensions. And sitting at the center of all this mythology was Enoch, an Altrusian from the distant past who had traveled through time only to discover the horrifying fate of his own people. The Sleestack, those hissing, dim-witted creatures of the dark, were actually the devolved descendants of Enoch's once great civilization. It was a devastating backstory for a Saturday morning show, and it gave the series a weight that nobody expected. The family caught in the middle of all this was the Marshalls. Rick Marshall, a park ranger played by stage actor Spencer Milligan, was a capable, level-headed father. His teenage son Will, played by Wesley Ure, who was already appearing on the daytime soap Days of Our Lives, and his younger daughter Holly, played by newcomer Kathy Coleman. The three of them went whitewater rafting. An earthquake hit. They were swept over a waterfall, and suddenly they were in the land of the lost. The show was pitched to NBC and greenlit for the 1974 to 75 Saturday morning season. It premiered on September 7th, 1974 at 10 a.m.
Drink of water.
Oh, all right. Stay here.
Part 7. The Writers Who Made It More Than a Kids Show. One of the most unusual things about Land of the Lost, and one of the main reasons it has endured the way it has, is the roster of writers Gerald assembled for the first season. Saturday morning television in 1974 was not generally considered fertile ground for serious storytelling. The dominant logic of the era was simple: give kids cartoons, keep things moving, don't overthink it. Animated shows were cheap to produce and easy to recycle. Networks ordered the minimum number of episodes, usually around 17, knowing that children would happily watch the same episodes over and over. The expectation was low. The ambition was lower. Gerald ignored all of that. Drawing on his connections from the Star Trek world, he recruited some of the most respected science fiction writers working at the time. Larry Niven, whose novel Ringworld had won the Hugo and Nebula Awards just a few years earlier, wrote for the show. Theodore Sturgeon, one of the most celebrated short story writers in American science fiction history, contributed scripts. Ben Bova, then the editor of Analog Science Fiction magazine, wrote for it. Norman Spinrad was brought in. D.C. Fontana, who had served as script editor on the original Star Trek, contributed an episode, and Walter Koenig, who had played Ensign Chekhov on Star Trek, wrote one of the most pivotal episodes of the entire run, The Stranger, which introduced Enoch and laid out the tragic history of the Altrusians and the Sleestak.
Here, I'll take them.
Daddy gave them to me.
Okay. Hey, let's take the shortcut.
These writers treated the show's premise seriously. They explored the implications of the pocket universe, wrote stories that hinged on time paradoxes, and developed the mythology of the pylons and the crystals with real internal consistency. There was an episode, Hurricane, written by Larry Niven, that dealt with the consequences of tampering with the pylons in ways that still hold up as solid science fiction storytelling. The season finale, The Circle, co-written by Niven and Gerald, was specifically designed to create an ambiguous ending that could loop back into a cycle of reruns, but also functioned as a genuinely satisfying resolution if the show was never renewed. That kind of structural thinking was unheard of in children's television at the time. The physical production matched the storytelling ambition as closely as the budget allowed. For the first 2 seasons, the show was filmed on a modular indoor soundstage at General Service Studios in Hollywood. A small number of sets and scenic props were rearranged constantly to suggest the vast jungles, cave systems, and ancient cities of the Lost World. Miniatures and chroma key compositing were used extensively. The dinosaurs, 3 of which became recurring characters, the Tyrannosaur Grumpy, the Allosaur Big Alice, and the young Brontosaur Dopey, were realized through stop-motion animation, a technique pioneered by Willis O'Brien in King Kong and refined by Ray Harryhausen in films like Jason and the Argonauts. It was painstaking, time-consuming work, but it gave the creatures a real physical presence that purely mechanical puppets could not have matched. To play the Sleestak, tall, hulking, slow-moving creatures who were genuinely unsettling to young viewers, the production recruited members of the University of Southern California basketball team, including players who would later go on to NBA careers. Dave Greenwood, who who played for the Chicago Bulls, and Bill Laimbeer, who became a central figure on the Detroit Pistons championship teams of the late 1980s. The show worked. On every level, it worked.
We can run on schedule. Phew.
Ah, well, hello, Chaka.
Part 6, Season 1, The Peak. The first season of Land of the Lost consisted of 17 episodes and aired from September 1974 through January 1975. For anyone who watched it as a child, that first season has a particular quality that is difficult to describe, but easy to recognize. It felt real, not realistic. No one was confused about whether this was a documentary about dimensional portals, but emotionally real. The Marshall family felt like an actual family. Their fear felt genuine. The world they were trapped in felt large and unknowable and genuinely dangerous. Part of that came from the performances. Spencer Milligan's Rick Marshall was not a superhero or an action figure. He was a smart, resourceful man doing his best in an impossible situation. He made mistakes. He worried. He was clearly a father who loved his children, and that warmth gave the show a human center that no amount of stop-motion animation could have provided on its own. Wesley Urey and Kathy Coleman, meanwhile, were natural and likable in a way that child actors in genre television rarely managed. Their friendship with Chaka, the young Pakuni played by Philip Paley, who was learning their language and customs at the same rate they were learning his, gave the show its gentlest and most endearing thread. But the mythology is what truly set the first season apart. Enoch's introduction, the revelation of what the Sleestak actually were, the slow unraveling of how the pylons worked, the question of whether the Marshalls would ever find their way home. These elements were handled with a patience and discipline that respected the audience. Nothing was over-explained. The Land of the Lost was allowed to remain mysterious, and that mystery was precisely what kept viewers coming back.
What we really need here is a guinea pig.
Guinea pig?
Yeah, you know, some weird little creature that we could test the food on to see if it's okay.
But what do we...
NBC confirmed the show would return for a second season, which was unusual. As noted, the standard model for Saturday morning children's television at the time was 17 episodes and then reruns. The fact that Land of the Lost was renewed was a reflection of how strong its performance had been. Part 5, Season 2, The Bridge. The second season, which ran through 1975, maintained much of what had made the first season successful while quietly beginning to shift. Gerald had departed as story editor by the time the second season was fully underway, frustrated with interference from the show's directors, who had a habit of rewriting scripts on set. With him went most of the high-profile science fiction writers from Season 1. Story editing duties were handled by Dick Morgan and Tom Swale, both of whom contributed scripts and did solid work keeping the series on course. The mythology continued to develop. New creatures appeared. The Marshalls continued to search for a way home. The effects budget remained roughly comparable to the first season, and the core cast was intact. Spencer Milligan was still there as Rick. The chemistry between the three leads was still palpable. Chaka was now a credited cast member, and Philip Paley's warmth in the role gave the season some of its best moments. There was, however, a financial storm building behind the scenes. As the show gained popularity, merchandise followed. There were Land of the Lost lunchboxes, toy sets, compasses, and dinosaur figures manufactured by Laramie, among other products. Spencer Milligan noticed that his face and the faces of his co-stars were appearing on these products. No one had asked permission. No one had offered compensation. Milligan raised the issue with the producers. He wanted a salary increase, and he wanted the cast to receive a share of the merchandising profits, a position that, in the modern era of Hollywood contracts, would be considered entirely standard. In 2009, Milligan described the dispute straightforwardly. The show was selling items featuring his likeness, and he felt it was only fair that everyone should get their fair share. The Croft organization declined. Milligan walked away from the show at the end of the second season. He did not return for season 3.
Easy, Chuck, easy. I'm not gonna hurt you, okay? Friend. Huh? Friend. Easy, easy.
Usu.
Part 4, Season 3, The Unraveling. The third season of Land of the Lost premiered on September 11, 1976, and ran for 13 episodes, concluding on December 4th, 1976. The challenge of addressing Milligan's absence was handled in the season's opening episode, Aftershock. An earthquake strikes the Land of the Lost, and during the chaos, Rick Marshall accidentally falls through a temporal portal and is transported back to Earth alone, leaving Will and Holly stranded without their father. As a practical matter, the scene was filmed without Milligan. John Kubichan, who had written and produced the episode, wore a wig meant to resemble Milligan's hair and stood with his back to the camera. It was not a convincing solution. Rick was quickly replaced by his brother, Jack Marshall, played by Ron Harper, who had just come off a role in the short-lived Planet of the Apes television series. Harper was a capable actor, but the premise required an enormous suspension of disbelief that Jack had independently found the same dimensional portal that had swallowed his brother's family, had traveled through it, and had arrived in the same time and place. The show offered no real explanation for how that could have happened, because there was no plausible explanation to offer. The loss of Milligan was significant on its own, but the third season was also contending with broader changes that had nothing to do with casting.
It's turned into a swamp.
What's that?
The production shifted its emphasis away from the mythological storytelling that had defined the first 2 seasons. The Sleestack became less frightening. The storylines became more episodic, more reliant on one-off guest characters, and less anchored in the internal logic of the Pocket universe. Guest stars began appearing regularly. In one episode, a character from the old American West arrived, a Nez Perce man named Lone Wolf, and a U.S. cavalry officer named Captain Diggs. There were storylines involving invisible characters, a mystical orb, and a marketplace barbarian named Malik, played by Richard Kiel. These were not bad stories necessarily, but they had the feeling of a show spinning its wheels rather than moving forward. The budget also tightened, new sets were created, but the overall production had a cheaper look than the earlier seasons. The original theme song, which had been composed by Linda Laurie and was closely associated with Spencer Milligan's version of The Family, had to be retired when Milligan left, since it included his character's name in the opening credits sequence. A new theme was composed for Season 3, using stock footage from previous episodes patched together for the new opening. The effect was noticeably jarring to viewers who remembered the original. Geralt was gone. The major science fiction writers were gone. The original lead actor was gone. And while the show continued to pull a respectable audience, it was still a children's Saturday morning program and not without its charms. Something fundamental had been lost.
Who are?
Enoch, the Altrusian.
Hey, listen, whoever you are, thanks. Those monsters.
Part 3, Why NBC Pulled the Plug. The final episode of Land of the Lost aired on December 4th, 1976. NBC did not renew the show for a 4th season, and the cancellation was the product of several forces converging at once. The most practical factor was cost. Land of the Lost had always been expensive relative to what Saturday morning television typically spent. The stop-motion animation required for the dinosaur sequences was labor-intensive and time-consuming. The soundstage sets, the miniature work, the chroma key compositing, all of it demanded more resources than a simple animated show. By 1976, the network was looking for ways to trim costs across its Saturday morning lineup, and a live-action show with a complicated production pipeline was an easy target. At the same time, the competitive landscape for Saturday mornings was changing. Sports programming was beginning to claim more airtime on weekend mornings, and networks were recalibrating their schedules accordingly. The traditional model of wall-to-wall children's programming on Saturday mornings was gradually giving way to a more fragmented schedule, and cheaper animated productions were filling the gaps left by more expensive live-action series. The third season's creative struggles also played a role. Without the mythological depth of the first two seasons, and without the audience's connection to the original Marshall family, the show had a harder time justifying its production costs. It was no longer doing something that nobody else was doing. It had, in the view of the network, run its course. 43 episodes, 3 seasons, September 1974 to December 1976. Part 2, The Aftermath, Syndication, Revival, and Legacy. The Cancellation was not, as it turned out, the end of the story. Land of the Lost moved into daily syndication in 1978 as part of the Croft Superstars package, and it ran in that format until 1985. A new generation of children encountered it through afternoon reruns and weekend broadcasts. In 1985, CBS briefly used it as a summer replacement series, and again in 1987. By that point, the original audience, those kids who had been 8 or 10 years old in 1974, were adults, and the show was becoming something they remembered with genuine affection.
Akash.
All right, Sleestack, let's go, come on.
In 1985, CBS did brief summer airings of the original series, and later the Sci-Fi Channel picked it up for reruns in the 1990s. The cult grew steadily. People remembered not just the dinosaurs and the Sleestack, but the ideas, the pocket universe, the pylons, the mystery of the Altrusians, the sense of being genuinely, irrevocably lost. In 1991, Sid and Marty Krofft decided to revisit the property with a new series for ABC. The 1991 version of Land of the Lost ran for 2 seasons and 26 episodes. It featured a different family, the Porters, with Timothy Bottoms as the father, and it retained the basic setting while largely abandoning the deep mythology that had made the original so distinctive. David Gerrold was not involved. The 1991 series was competently made and performed adequately in its Saturday morning slot, but it never captured the imagination the way the original had. It was canceled in 1992 without a proper conclusion, and over time, it has faded from cultural memory in a way that the 1974 series never has. In 2009, a feature film adaptation was released, directed by Brad Silberling and starring Will Ferrell. It was conceived as a comedy parody of the original series, aimed squarely at the adult nostalgia market. The film earned just over $68 million worldwide against a production budget of $100 million. And it holds a 26% score on Rotten Tomatoes. It was by any measure a significant commercial and critical failure, and the Krofft brothers publicly distanced themselves from it afterward, referring to it in interviews simply as that other movie. The DVD releases of the original series, distributed by Rhino Entertainment between 2004 and 2005, introduced the show to yet another generation and earned a Saturn Award nomination for Best Retro Television Series Release in 2004. The discs included commentaries from Gerrold, Larry Niven, and D.C. Fontana, offering a detailed first-hand account of how the show had been made and what it had been trying to accomplish. In more recent years, discussions of a new adaptation have continued. As of early 2026, Netflix has been reported to be in early stages of development on a reboot, with legendary television involved and Deanna Croft Pope, Marty Croft's daughter, attached as producer. No writer had been attached at the time those reports surfaced. Whether any new version will capture what made the original special remains an open question, but the fact that the conversation keeps returning to Land of the Lost says something real about what the show accomplished.
Then where are we?
Part 1. What it actually was. It is worth stepping back and considering what Land of the Lost actually was, in the context of when it was made. In 1974, there was almost no science fiction on primetime American television. The $6 Million Man was in its second season on ABC. Kolchak, The Night Stalker, was on Friday nights. That was largely it. The genre had not yet found a comfortable home in the evening schedules, and audiences looking for genuine speculative fiction had very few options. Into that environment came a Saturday morning children's show that treated its audience, those kids sitting in front of the TV with their cereal, as though they were capable of following a complex mythology, thinking about dimensional physics, and engaging with the moral complexity of a character like Enoch, who knew what his people had become and was powerless to prevent it. The show did not talk down to its audience. It trusted them. That trust was, in retrospect, the defining quality of the first 2 seasons and the thing that the 3rd season largely abandoned. When Gerald and his writers left, when the internal logic of the Pocket universe stopped being something the show protected and developed, the series lost the quality that had made it worth watching. It became just another adventure show, and adventure shows were cheaper and easier to make without building an entire mythology to support them. Spencer Milligan, who played Rick Marshall in those first 2 seasons, died on April 18, 2024, at the age of 86 at his home in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Ron Harper, who had taken over as Jack Marshall in season 3, died just weeks earlier. The 2 men had, in a way, bookended the show's transformation, one representing what it had been, the other representing what it became. Wesley Ure, who had played Will Marshall throughout the entire original run, paid tribute to Milligan on social media after his passing, calling him a true father figure to the cast. Land of the Lost ran for 43 episodes and lasted 2 years on NBC. It was not canceled because it had failed. It was canceled while it was still being watched, still being remembered, still being talked about by the kids who had grown up with it. The rise was built on ambition that nobody expected from a Saturday morning show. Real science fiction writers, a genuinely conceived mythology, performances that treated the material seriously, and a world that felt worth exploring. The fall came slowly, through the departure of the creative talent that had built it, a cast dispute that cost the show its central figure, a 3rd season that couldn't find the same footing, and a network calculation that determined the budget no longer made sense. But 50 years on, it's the rise that people remember. The pylons, the crystals, the Sleestak hissing in the dark, Chaka learning to say their names, Rick Marshall telling his kids they were going to find their way home. That's what stayed with people. That's what keeps bringing them back. That is, in the end, the whole story of the rise and fall of Land of the Lost, why it ended at its peak. If you found this video interesting, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. There are a lot more stories like this one waiting.